Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 69 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we get started, I wanted to let you all know about another podcast I've recently discovered. Actually, why don't I let the host tell you all about it himself? Steve?
Hello, welcome to Geektown listeners. This is Steve from the Frankenculture Podcast. The Frankenculture Podcast is a weekly video game podcast with news, reviews, and opinions on the industry today. Also in the feed is It Used to Be Better, a podcast where myself and my co-host, my wife April, watch a movie from our upbringing or one we just really like that the other hasn't seen, see if it holds up, or it used to be better. You can find us on all podcast platforms under Frankenculture Presents. And now, here's Kurt with Welcome to Geektown.
Video games are not a topic I talk about all that much, being mostly out of my wheelhouse. So if that's an interest of yours, be sure to go check out Frankenculture. However, this week I actually am talking about video games, or at least video game adaptations. Reddit user Yakun asked a while ago, why do the movie adaptations of video games usually flop and perform terrible with both critics and the box office? Well, there have been a couple of recent movies that tried to buck this trend and perform better than most of their video game-based compatriots, with Detective Pikachu and Sonic the Hedgehog. Neither of these really set the box office on fire, nor got critics raving, so even the best performing video game movie hasn't been any sort of record setter. But if you compare global box office performance to the film's budget, the majority of video game based movies have done well enough to avoid the flop tag, with one grouping that I'll call out later being the main exception. So while I slightly disagree with Yakun's premise, it definitely isn't completely off. On their surface, many video game movies have a lot of similarities to superhero films. There's usually a lead character or team from a known IP, intellectual property, who's more powerful or more skilled than the average person that is fighting against a similarly powered villain or force. So there's no obvious reason that one genre dominates the box office while the other does okay, if not poorly. Let's investigate and see if we can come up with a few reasons that explain this discrepancy. The first thing I'd like to point out is that video games really haven't been around all that long compared to other art forms. And you'll get no argument from me that video games are an art form just like every other piece of entertainment. And if you want a video game that has anything resembling a real story, you have to go even later. Early games like Pong, Pac-Man, and Breakout don't have much in the way of world building that would necessarily attract a writer to want to build a 2-hour story around them. Early text adventure games like Zork have more rich backstories, and a Zork movie was announced in 1996 as being in the works, but never ended up happening. But overall, you had to wait until at least the mid to late 1980s before you got video games that combined graphics, sound, and text to give an interesting enough world to justify licensing the property for qualities beyond just a recognizable name. On that same note, video game movies have been around for a lot shorter time than superhero films or any other action movie in general. The first major studio release directly based on a video game property is Super Mario Bros., which came out in 1993. Compare that 27-year stretch to the length of time superhero movies have been around. Depending on how you define it, you could go back to the 1920s Zorro movie, the 1940s serials starring Superman, Batman, and Captain America, or at the very latest, the 1966 Batman as the first superhero movie. That's at least twice the amount of time that pulp and comic book heroes have been part of film history, compared to their video game character counterparts. So there's just been less time available to figure out what makes a good video game movie. And figuring that out takes a certain type of creator. Listen to interviews with directors of the most successful comic book movies. When asked about the original property, most often these directors will say that they grew up reading the comics and enjoyed them. But at the same time, they don't have a slavish devotion to the source material, and are willing to make some changes to better adapt the character to the screen rather than the page. With video games, we're just now getting to the first or possibly second generation of directors that grew up with the games in question, depending on where you define generations. Finding a director that is passionate about the material, but also has a vision of how they'll adapt the property to the big screen, as opposed to the big screen TV, is a challenge in and of itself. And one obstacle to finding that right director is that one man has been the one in charge of many of these adaptations. Uwe Boll. I mentioned up top that there was one group of movies that have not done well enough to avoid being labeled as flops. Those are the films of writer, director, producer Uwe Boll. Between 2003 and 2017, Boll was the driving force of about a dozen different movies based on video games, covering at least 5 different properties. And few, if any, of those films made their money back, nor were any critical successes. In fact, Boll has 3 Raspberry Awards for Worst Director, plus an honorary Raspberry for Worst Career Achievement. Thanks to some now defunct tax laws in his home country of Germany, Uwe himself continued to make money on the projects, allowing him to finance more movies in those franchises. For some people, Boll's movies fall into the so bad it's good range, and personally that is the case for one of his video game films for me. In the Name of the King, based loosely on the Dungeon Siege series of games. Starring Jason Statham, Ray Liotta, and featuring performances from Matthew Lillard, Lily Sobieski, Ron Perlman, and Burt Reynolds, the movie is a glorious train wreck that I just can't help but laugh at giddily as it bumbles its way through chewed-up scenery and lackluster special effects to the movie's overwrought climax. But, in my opinion, that one film is an outlier, and most of the pictures Boll has released are just plain bad. Unfortunately, since so many video game movies were made by this one creator, that's tarnished the genre, making it more difficult to get larger studios to put a decent amount of money behind a more legitimate adaptation. These are some of the more utilitarian reasons why video game movies have rarely been successful, but are there more esoteric reasons? Well, some people argue that the structure of a video game doesn't translate well to a movie. Why? Well, a film usually sticks to the basic 3-act structure, with the first act being setup, bringing the lead character or characters into the action, the second act being a series of rising obstacles with a big twist at the midpoint, not necessarily a Shyamalan-level twist, but some sort of reveal or change. and a moment of helplessness right before the climax, which brings us to the resolution in the third act, where the world is brought back to some semblance of normality. Comic books, and prose books, also tend to follow this basic structure, making the adaptation process relatively simple. Video games, on the other hand, are an entirely different art form. As you may recall from my interview with Evan Skolnick, the story and writing in video games usually takes a back seat to the gameplay. And if you look at the structure of most games, there's very rarely any setup involved, and it's simply a series of obstacles that get successfully more difficult, even as the character you're playing gets more and more powerful, until you reach the end. It's basically just Act 2, but with no midpoint twist and no crisis before the climax. So, in order to translate the story of the game, assuming there is one, into a film, you need to make a lot of changes and additions. Doing that while still feeling like you're staying true to the spirit of the game may be a nearly impossible task. But that's not going to stop Hollywood from continuing to try. With a Monster Hunter movie theoretically releasing at the end of this year, and an Uncharted film starring Tom Holland, best known as the MCU Spider-Man, among other video game adaptations on their way, perhaps one of these will solve that riddle of how to make a film that appeals to hardcore fans of the games, as well as a general audience and critics. Meanwhile, listener Jesse C. asked me the exact opposite question. He wrote, quote, "There are some exceptions, but most movie-to-video game adaptations are lackluster. What are the reasons for this?" He asked this on my Facebook page, intending it as a question for Evan Skolnick, but I didn't end up fitting it in. However, I did get an answer from video game industry veteran Aaron Levitz, also the writer of the theme song for Welcome to Geektown. And I thought I'd share it with all of you while we're on this related subject. Aaron listed a number of reasons in his response. To quote, "Inflexible deadlines, limited time with the voice talent / limited ability to recast voice talent, limited access to the creative staff making that film, because they are, after all, making a film, expectation that 2 hours of story will stretch to fill 20 plus hours of gameplay, development driven by outside marketing forces as opposed to iterative changes through rigorous playtesting, having to adapt your game to reflect late reshoots while the launch deadline isn't changing, and so forth. On top of this, you have a layer of compromise meant to make meeting those challenges easier. Specifically, rather than develop a new game around the needs of a movie, it's more common to license and customize an existing game, reskinning the characters and settings, and shoehorning in one or two elements of the film to seem less generic. But this is also true outside of movies. Really, any game with licensed characters has a litany of traps to avoid, and can't afford to take creative risks, because those licenses were so expensive. Thank you for the feedback, Aaron. As I've said, video games aren't one of my primary interests, so it's good to get a more expert opinion when these sorts of questions come up. And thank you both to Jesse C. and Reddit user Yakun for your questions this week. As always, I'm definitely looking for more questions to answer for future episodes. So be sure to send those in, or any comments you have on the show in general, to me via email at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or visit the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link there. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.